Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive into one of history's most, energetic periods, youth rebellions in the Americas during the 60s and 70s.
Lots of energy there, yeah.
We'll mainly be focusing on the USA for this deep dive.
Of course, the U.S. was kind of the epicenter.
But later on, we'll also take a look at how things were playing out in Canada and Mexico.
It really was a global phenomenon.
Exactly. But you might be surprised to hear that our main source material this time around is a lecture series.
Oh!
Yeah, it's called Mr. Hutchings History.
Interesting.
It seems like it was originally made for high school students.
Okay.
But don't let that fool ya. It's actually got some pretty nuanced takes on the era.
Mr. Hutchings does a great job of setting the stage.
Yeah, he really does.
And it's important to keep in mind that this wasn't just some isolated youth thing, you know?
Right.
The 60s and 70s were a time of global upheaval.
Yeah, sure.
And the U.S. was right in the thick of it.
So let's break down what was going on back then.
Okay.
We had this huge post-war boom, new technologies popping up left and right,
Like,
color TVs becoming the norm, the jet age taking off.
yeah, it felt like a whole new world.
But simmering under the surface, you had the Vietnam War escalating, the civil rights movement gaining serious traction,
Right.
and a growing awareness of environmental problems, too.
Pollution, resource depletion, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And I think what's fascinating is how these seemingly separate things were actually deeply interconnected.
Yeah, right.
That rapid technological advancement, the economic boom, it really highlighted the contrast with the realities of war, poverty, and social injustice. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like the shiny surface of progress just made the cracks underneath even more obvious.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like the classic 50s ideal was starting to fall apart.
All right.
And young people were the ones pointing out where it was broken.
Okay, so on to the big questions for this deep dive. What were the specific grievances that young people had? How did they choose to express their discontent? And the million-dollar question, did those youth movements actually change anything?
Those are great questions.
And to really get into the why, we need to go a little deeper than just listing those general issues of the time.
Okay, I'm with you.
Like, take the draft for the Vietnam War.
Oh, yeah. That was a huge one.
It wasn't applied equally. It disproportionately impacted working-class youth.
Those who couldn't afford to go to college and get a deferment.
Exactly. So you start to see this resentment brewing, not just against the war itself, but against the entire system.
Makes sense.
It felt like the system was sending certain groups of young men off to die while others were protected.
It wasn't just about opposing war in some abstract way.
Right.
It was about the very real personal fear of being sent to fight and die in a war you didn't believe in.
Exactly.
So how did this discontent actually manifest?
Well, we see a wide range of actions, from peaceful sit-ins to massive protests, and even the emergence of the counterculture movement.
Right, with its rejection of mainstream values and all that.
And its emphasis on peace, love, individual expression.
Yeah, the counterculture is such a fascinating aspect of this era.
It really is.
You have all these young people rejecting traditional career paths, experimenting with communal living.
Embracing alternative forms of spirituality.
Do you think it was purely a form of rebellion? Or was there something more going on?
Honestly, I think it was both. There was definitely an element of rebellion there, a rejection of that materialistic consumerist culture.
Right.
They saw it as shallow and unfulfilling.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
I think there was also a genuine desire for something more, a yearning for authentic experiences.
I agree. The deeper connection to nature, to each other, to something beyond just material possessions.
It's like they were trying to create a whole new way of life.
A new set of values.
And this ties into the protests as well.
You're right.
You had the iconic anti-war demonstrations, but also the civil rights movement with its sit-ins, freedom rides, marches.
And each of these movements had its own internal debates about strategy and tactics.
Absolutely.
For example, within the civil rights movement, you had a whole spectrum of approaches.
From the nonviolent resistance of Martin Luther King Jr.
To the more militant stance of groups like the Black Panther Party.
Exactly. And these debates reflect just how complex the issues were.
And how diverse the perspectives were within those movements.
And on college campuses, you had the free speech movement, right?
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Which this wasn't just about some abstract ideals, it was about very specific restrictions on student political activities.
Right. It was about students' rights to organize and speak out against what they saw as injustices.
Exactly.
So was it this clash between the desire for open dialogue, questioning authority, and that whole Cold War mentality of silencing anyone who seemed like a threat?
I think you hit the nail on the head there.
It's really interesting how these different movements, while having different goals, seem to share that common thread of challenging authority.
And demanding change.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that they weren't just targeting specific policies.
They were trying to transform the very culture and values of American society.
That's a huge undertaking.
It really is. And it's also remarkable how they used a variety of tactics to try to achieve that.
From peaceful demonstrations to more confrontational approaches.
We've talked about sit-ins and marches, but there were also instances of property damage, clashes with police.
And tragically, loss of life as well.
That brings us to a really crucial question. Did these sometimes radical tactics actually help or hinder the movement's goals? Were these young people actually effective in achieving lasting change?
I'm really eager to unpack that in our next part. Welcome back to our deep dive into youth rebellions of the 60s and 70s.
Back for more.
Last time, we talked about the post-war context and some of those grievances fueling these uprisings.
Right, we set the stage.
And we touched on how young people expressed their discontent.
From peaceful protest
To that cultural revolution of the counterculture.
Yeah, and we left off with a big question.
We did.
Did those sometimes radical tactics actually help or hinder the movement's goals?
Were these young people actually able to achieve lasting change?
It's tough to say for sure.
Yeah, to unpack this, I think looking at specific examples will help.
Definitely.
So let's start with the Vietnam War.
Okay.
It's hard to overstate just how much that conflict loomed over everything.
Yeah, the draft, those images coming back from the war zone,
Yeah.
it galvanized a generation.
And the government's response to the growing anti-war sentiment was, well,
Complicated.
put it mildly.
Well, the escalation of the war under Johnson,
More bombs, more troops on the ground,
which, of course, just added fuel to the fire.
leading to even larger protests.
This is a bit of a vicious cycle.
And then, of course, you have the tragedy at Kent State in 1970.
Oh, yeah.
4 unarmed students killed by the National Guard during a protest against the war.
A real turning point.
I remember learning about that in school, seeing those photographs. It was chilling.
Absolutely chilling.
You can't underestimate the effect that had.
Not just on the anti-war movement.
But on the national psyche as a whole.
Really raised those questions about the limits of dissent, you know?
And about the government's willingness to use force against its own citizens.
Exactly.
It also exposed a huge divide in American society.
Between those who saw the students as martyrs,
Victims of an unjust war and a repressive government.
and then you had those who saw them as unpatriotic troublemakers.
It's a division that still echoes today, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. That's a divide that seems to run deeper than ever.
And it wasn't just Kent State.
Right.
Remember the FBI's COINTELPRO program?
Oh, man, talk about chilling.
The extent of government surveillance on activist groups.
When those programs came to light, it really eroded public trust.
It fed that narrative that the government was trying to silence dissent.
Learning about COINTELPRO was a real eye-opener for me.
Me too.
It makes you question how much freedom of expression actually existed back then.
That's a crucial point.
It wasn't just about specific policy changes,
It was about the very right to dissent, to imagine a different future.
and the government's response, with COINTELPRO, shows the lengths they go to maintain control.
But despite those crackdowns, there are victories too.
Yeah, for sure.
The civil rights movement achieved monumental breakthroughs.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
They fundamentally changed the legal landscape.
And those victories didn't come easy.
Years of activism, countless acts of courage.
It's easy to look back and think it was inevitable.
But there was intense resistance.
Violence, entrenched power structures.
And it's important to remember that the fight for equality didn't end there.
Absolutely not.
The struggle continues.
And that's a key takeaway from these movements.
What is?
They weren't just about achieving specific goals.
Right. They were about sparking a process of transformation.
Challenging injustice, demanding a more equitable and just society.
So how did they approach that monumental task?
Well, we talked about the spectrum of tactics used by the civil rights movement.
From nonviolent resistance to more militant approaches.
Were similar debates happening within other movements, like the anti-war movement or the women's rights movement?
Definitely internal debates were a defining feature of that era.
Take the anti-war movement, for example.
Okay.
There were disagreements on how to pressure the government,
Some advocated for peaceful protests,
lobbying efforts,
while others thought more confrontational tactics were necessary.
like disrupting draft offices, destroying war materials.
It's like they were constantly trying to figure out how to be most effective.
How to get their message across, how to make those in power listen.
And sometimes those debates led to divisions within the movements.
That's one of the biggest challenges for any social movement.
What is?
Maintaining unity, especially when dealing with such complex issues.
So it's not a simple story then.
Not at all.
Not just heroes and villains.
Shades of gray, internal struggles.
Mistakes made.
It's important to acknowledge that complexity.
And remember, these movements weren't happening in isolation.
Right, the Vietnam War, civil rights, women's rights, the environmental movement.
They were all interconnected, feeding off each other, influencing tactics and strategies.
It was all part of a much larger cultural shift.
A rejection of traditional norms and values.
You had the counterculture challenging consumerism.
Embracing alternative lifestyles.
Feminists demanding a redefinition of gender roles.
It was a time of immense cultural change.
Boundaries being pushed, traditional power structures challenged.
It felt like everything was up for grabs.
And young people were leading the charge.
It wasn't just confined to the U.S. either.
We mentioned this Sir George Williams affair in Canada.
And the Tlatelolco Massacre in Mexico.
But to truly grasp the global scope of this, we need to broaden our perspective even more.
You're right. Let's zoom out and explore how these movements were playing out in other parts of the world.
See what common threads we can find.
What unique challenges activists faced in different contexts.
We'll tackle those questions when we come back for the final part of our deep dive.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into the youth rebellions of the 60s and 70s.
Glad to be back.
We've spent most of our time in the U.S. so far.
Unpacking those motivations.
Tactics, impacts.
But as we said last time,
Yeah.
this energy wasn't just in America.
It really did feel like a global wave.
Each wave, of course, unique to its own context.
But sharing that common thread.
Young people rising up, challenging the way things were.
Almost like a ripple effect.
You see it happening in one place.
And then suddenly, it's everywhere.
Young people saying, hey, we want change too.
It's powerful stuff.
Remember those anxieties we talked about way back in part 1?
Oh, yeah.
The rapid tech advancements.
The Cold War tensions.
That feeling that the old ways weren't working anymore.
Yeah, that was global.
So let's zoom out a bit.
Okay,
Explore that global dimension.
You mentioned the Sir George Williams affair in Canada.
Yeah, powerful example.
Exposing racism against Caribbean students.
This happened in '69.
At Sir George Williams University in Montreal.
And it really shows how these movements intersected with colonialism, race, identity.
It wasn't just about one professor.
No, not at
It was about the whole system.
Systemic bias
in the Institute.
in Canadian society as a whole.
So students were using their platforms to challenge global power structures.
It wasn't just about protesting within the system.
They wanted to change the system itself.
We see that in other parts of the world too.
Oh.
France, in May 1968.
Ah, les événements de mai.
That's the one.
Incredible social and political upheaval.
Challenging everything.
Hierarchies, social norms, the structure of the government.
Fueled by specific grievances, but also that desire for freedom.
Autonomy, a more just society.
That sounds familiar, right?
It does.
It's a pattern.
We see it again and again.
Czechoslovakia, Prague Spring, '68.
Political liberalization, crushed by a Soviet invasion.
The yearning for self-determination.
Breaking free from authoritarian rule.
These events had a huge impact.
On the global political landscape?
Absolutely. They showed that desire for change.
It transcended borders.
The old powers were being challenged.
It was transformative.
And while they didn't always succeed right away,
Right.
they planted those seeds.
For future.
Inspired generations of activists?
But of course, not all of these movements had happy endings.
Unfortunately not.
We talked about the Tlatelolco Massacre in Mexico,
1968.
where the government brutally suppressed those student protests.
A stark reminder.
Of the risks of challenging authoritarian regimes.
How far some governments will go to silence dissent.
It's heartbreaking.
The lives lost.
The potential.
A reminder that freedom isn't free.
It's hard-won, constantly under threat.
It underscores the importance of solidarity.
Supporting those activists.
Risking their lives for justice.
But it also highlights the complexities.
These movements weren't always peaceful.
Or unified.
Sometimes those actions had consequences they didn't intend.
It's easy to romanticize the past.
See things through rose-colored glasses.
But it's important to acknowledge the messiness.
The struggles, the mistakes.
That's part of what makes studying this era so fascinating.
It wasn't just heroes and villains.
A complex mix of forces.
Driven by people with their own beliefs and motivations.
So, looking back at all of this,
All that global youth activism,
what stands out as the biggest legacy?
hope, that enduring power of hope,
That even when things seem impossible,
change ISIS possible.
these movements showed us that young people have power,
The power to shake things up,
challenge injustice,
demand a better future.
and it's a legacy that's still inspiring today.
Absolutely.
When we see young people marching for climate justice, organizing for racial equality, fighting for LGBTQ plus rights, we're seeing that legacy.
The movements of that era prove that collective action matters.
That even small acts of resistance can create change.
They taught us about coalition building,
The need to address the root causes.
the persistence needed for lasting change,
And it's a reminder that the fight continues.
for a more just and equitable world,
It's an ongoing process,
each generation taking up the torch,
learning from the past,
both the good and the bad.
applying those lessons to the challenges we face now.
Exactly. As we wrap up our deep dive here, I encourage you to think about what resonated with you the most.
What questions does it raise for you?
About activism, about social change.
The role of young people in shaping the world.
It's been a great conversation.
It has. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been enlightening, inspiring, and thought-provoking.
To all our listeners, thank you for being here.
We hope you've enjoyed it.
We encourage you to keep exploring these themes.
Until next time, keep questioning.
Keep learning.
Keep pushing for a better world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.